Well, I really appreciate Judy sharing with us so practically from a life with rich experience. And in follow up, you may have noticed that Judy has really internalized a lot of God's Word, that she's able to refer to Scriptures, quote Scriptures. This didn't just happen by accident. She's been a servant of the Word, a person who really lived in the Word and memorized a lot of it. And in follow-up, she mentioned two verses that have meant a lot to her about controlling your thoughts. 2 Corinthians 10:5 that says, we take every thought captive. And Philippians 4:8, which talks about all the uplifting things that we should choose to focus our thoughts on. And so this is great practical advice for all of us. Well, let's go on to today's lesson. And what we want to do is we want to think about Hebrews 11:13 through 16. So let's just read that together. If you've got your Bible or the handout, it's in a box on your handout. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Okay, it says they did not receive the things promised. You see that up there in verse 13. What were these things that were promised? We kind of studied this last week when they finally got to the land of Canaan, modern day Jordan, Israel. God told Abraham, go outside and look around, all around you, north, south, east, west. All this land is going to be yours. And that's there on your handout, Genesis 13. And then Genesis 15, he took him outside and he said, look up at the stars and see if you can count them. Your descendants are going to be so numerous. And in a way, both of these promises were eventually fulfilled. Physically, the Jewish people were able to settle much of that land. And the Jewish nation became very large. And today, I think there's something like 14 million Jewish people in the world. However, the Hebrew writer and throughout the New Testament, at great pains to stress the spiritual side of the way these promises were fulfilled. Not just the physical side, a particular piece of geography, but instead the fact that we as Christians are spiritual descendants of Abraham and Sarah. Notice, though, it says that they saw these things and welcomed them from a distance. They saw them and welcomed them from a distance. They could look across and see it, but they never really got there during their lifetime. This is the idea that you can't quite see it, is a big idea throughout the book of Hebrews. In chapter 11, it talks about faith is the substance or the conviction of things not seen. In verse 3 of chapter 11, it says God created the universe out of things that were unseen or were invisible. And then in verse 7, it commends Noah because he acted because he was warned about events that were not yet seen. And so faith is acting on evidence, but it's not incontrovertible evidence. We are called upon to trust God, to take the evidence we do have and make a decision for God. And sometimes we can't see where he's leading us or what the reward will be for our actions. Well, the next thing that I want you to notice, and this is the key of today's lesson and the secret that Abraham and Sarah lived by that made them heroes of faith. It says they admitted, verse 13, that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. Specifically, if we go back to the book of Genesis, we can see Abraham doing this. He goes and sits down with the people in this local town and negotiates with them to buy this burial place, this field with a cave in it. He was going to use for a burial place. So he sits down, he says, you know, I just need to work this out with you because, and it's here on your sheet, Genesis 23:4, I am a foreigner and a stranger among you. Now, Abraham had been living in that part of the world for a long time, albeit as a nomad. That's where he got his mail, okay? That's where he lived, but he says, I don't have citizenship here. I'm a foreigner and a stranger. A Hebrew writer says, look, if Abraham didn't like being a foreigner and a stranger, he could have gone back to Ur. But God called him out of Ur and told him to live like a sojourner, like a non-citizen in this culture in Canaan. And he passed this down. We talk about all these people. He passed it down to his son Isaac, who married Rebekah, and she bought into the dream. And then they passed it down to their son Jacob, who had kind of a dysfunctional family. He had 12 sons and one daughter by 4 different women. These faith heroes are not perfect, okay? But anyway, he bought into the dream because late in his life, he got an audience with the king of Egypt, with Pharaoh, and he called him in and said, tell me about your life. He said, man, I've had a hard life. He says, Jacob said to Pharaoh, Genesis 47:9, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the pilgrimage of my fathers. Jacob said, my whole life has been a pilgrimage, a journey for a special spiritual goal. Pilgrimage. And so these people talk about themselves being foreigners, exiles, strangers, or pilgrims. One of the earliest novels ever written in the English language is this book, Pilgrim's Progress, and we don't have time to talk all about it today. But boy, it's a great story because it talks about this guy named Christian, and he's on his way to the celestial city. That's his destination. Well, Abraham and Sarah and their son Isaac and Rebekah, and then Jacob and his family became permanent residents in Canaan, but they, this is question 7 on your sheet, continued to refer to themselves as strangers, exiles, foreigners, pilgrims. Then we see a special episode in Abraham's life. Came to a very crucial point. Sarah has died. He's an old man. Isaac has grown up. It's time for Isaac to have a wife. Now, back then, the parents had a lot to do with selecting the mate for their child. In American culture, we don't do that so much anymore. I understand Chinese culture used to do that, but not so much anymore. But anyway, that's the way it was back then. But Abraham was very clear that he was looking for somebody special for his son that would live this life as a foreigner, as a pilgrim, and as an exile. So he called in his trusted servant. And he said to him, this is on the back of your handout, page 2. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I'm living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac. And the servant asked him, well, what if this woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? It's a long way by camel, from modern-day Iraq all the way back over here to modern-day Israel, Jordan. Shall I then take your son back to the country where you can get these two people together, and if she doesn't move, she won't move, maybe I'll move him back there. Abraham is very clear here. He says, make sure you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household in my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me on oath, saying, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. See, this dream, keeping the dream alive from generation to generation to generation, is such a big thing. And as Christians, we struggle with it. It's not easy to disciple your own children and your grandchildren. And they have a say in it too. It's not all up to you. You know, they have free will. They have to decide that they're going to buy into it also. But this idea that we are strangers, pilgrims, and exiles is not just for Abraham 4,000 years ago living like a nomad in the Middle East. The New Testament makes it clear that you and I are supposed to think about ourselves in the same way. For example, Philippians 3, starting in verse 19, says, "Their mind is set on earthly things, but our citizenship is in heaven." 1 Peter 1:17 says, "Since you call on a Father who judges each person's impartially, live out your time as foreigners in reverent fear." So here's the deal. One of my most prized possessions is this thing right here. And some of you have this too. This is my passport. And on the front, it says United States of America. Now, some of you don't have U.S. passports in the international class. And I hope you're just as thankful for your nation's passport as I am for this one. But this means that I am a citizen of the United States, and everything in the U.S. Constitution applies to me. And when I present myself, when I go out of the country and present myself at a port of entry and show them this, they have to let me back in. Now, I treasure this thing, but I want you to know something. It's nothing compared to a similar document, which is not hard copy, but I've got one that says I am a citizen of that heavenly city. That's where I'm really going. And I'm always just in transit, no matter if I have my U.S. passport or not. The main thing is that I see myself not as a citizen of the United States, but as a citizen of that heavenly city. In Hebrews, back to the book of Hebrews, chapter 13 and verse 14 says, you know, we need to leave the city that we're living in, and we need to go outside the city gates where Jesus was crucified and to bear the disgrace that he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city. In this life we do not have an enduring city, but we're headed for a heavenly city. And so when we live our lives with the concept of, hey, I'm not supposed to feel comfortable here. I'm not supposed to get at home with the culture here. I'm always supposed to be a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit irritated with the things that other people think are funny, or the things they devote their time and money to, or the way they eat or drink. That's not me, because I'm a citizen of a heavenly city, a New Jerusalem. That's where I'm headed, and when I get there, that's where I'm going to settle down. You know, this emphasis on a heavenly city runs counter to the emphasis that we find throughout a lot of Christianity today. A lot of Christian teachers and preachers emphasize that their teaching is designed to make your life better and make you better at life. And while I don't deny that being a Christian probably will do those things, that's not the goal. And while there is a lot to be said for alleviating suffering of people around us, of being a comfort to them, of praying with them, of feeding them if they're hungry and healing them if they're sick, Jesus sent out his disciples to teach and to heal. To teach and to heal. And the thing we really have to contribute to our world today is a passport that gets people to the heavenly city, not just making God's kingdom here on earth. That is really a very poor substitute for salvation, for what we really have to offer the world around us today. Well, I hope that this lesson this week has been an encouragement to you. I want to thank Judy again for being so open and sharing her own life with us. And I want to encourage you to think of yourself as a pilgrim on the way to the heavenly city. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about Abraham and Sarah and some of their ups and downs. And so I hope you'll make time to be with us then. God bless you this week. Please pray for me. I'm praying for you. Good news from Ryan and Rachel. After 11 weeks, they've been able to go back to their home, go back to their apartment. They'll have to stay inside for 14 days, kind of quarantine since they're coming from Wuhan. But anyway, we're just elated to hear that great news, and we thank God for it. God bless you, and we'll see you soon.